So, hello everybody. I think today, with it being spring, we are going to do some flowers, and I love to do layered flowers. A challenge with layered flowers is that you generally want one layer to dry before you work on the next layer, because with watercolors, if things are still wet, then you can have the colors intermingle and mush together, which is lovely in some situations, but for layered flowers you generally want each layer to be distinct from the other layers, and that means you need to give the flower petal time to dry before you paint something that's sort of overlapping it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint 3 of these at the same time, and part of this will be that you can see how it's happening, and you can paint along at a slower pace if you want to be able to paint the different layers of the petals. And that way we can also do different colors. So you don't need to do 3 layers, you can just work on one and then give it time to dry. Some people dry watercolors with hair dryers to get them to dry more quickly. The house here is actually fairly dry to start with, so it'll dry more quickly here than it would if it was somewhere humid, or if we were in the middle of thunderstorms. But we will see how this goes. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do similar things a couple times in a row, and then we will see how these flowers come out. So when you're painting flowers, your first thought is, what color are my flowers going to be? You can see here that I've got a bunch of different colors put together in my palette area, but it's always good to make yourself a color chart so that you can see what everything looks like on watercolor paper, because the way something looks here as a little dry lump of paint is sometimes fairly different from how it looks like when it is dry on a piece of watercolor paper. Especially with the greens, it can be really hard to tell what the different green colors are going to be. They just sort of look like greenish blobs, but their differences really come out when you look at the watercolor paper. So I highly recommend whatever watercolors you paint with, that you create yourself a color key. It doesn't take that long. You just draw some grids with a pencil, label each one with the name of the paint that's in it, and then put a block of color. And what I tried to do is I made the whole cube wet, and then I tried to put darker paint on one part and then lighter paint on the other part to try to show the gradient of colors available with a given paint. And for some paints it didn't really make a difference, like this yellow, but for some paints like this ultramarine, you can see that it has a little bit of different if you put it on heavy versus you putting it on light. So that's a good thing to do, just in case there is a substantial difference available to you if you go light. Well, you know, like the rose. The rose makes a pretty big difference if you put it on heavier versus if you put it on lighter. Alright, so one question you come up with when you're going to do your flowers is, what kind of colors do I want? Do I want like really vibrant, brilliant kinds of colors? Do I want, you know, more lighter, natural kinds of sap green colors? So it's completely up to you. So we'll do a couple different things in here for my experiments, but you can choose whatever colors make you happy. And for brushes, I do have a giant bin of brushes. I just bought a couple of assorted brush sets, but I tend to use just 1 or 2 for all my painting. So the rest of them I have just in case of, well, you know, like I use these for spattering and that sort of thing. So there's very specific situations that I might use some of these, but most of the time I just use 1 or 2 of them for most of my painting. Alright, so let me try to get my color chart to stay over here where it's out of the way. Alright, and we'll start with one of these. Normally when I do painting, I will draw something with pencil and then I will trace it with pen and ink, but I think today we'll just do straight watercolors. We'll see if I decide I want to try to do one with the pen and ink and the pencil technique, but to start with we will just do straight watercolors without any pencils or anything else. Alright, so Got a brush. This happens to be one of my low Cornell brushes, number 8. We will see. Alright, so let's go with a rose. We'll do a rose kind of color. Not a rose the flower, but a rose color for it, and I think I'll just use this top left one. Let's start there. Alright, so for the water, I have the water in an inexpensive little Tupperware kind of thing that has 2 segments. This way, when I am getting fresh clean water to paint with, I have this one over here, which will always be cleaner. And then when I'm rinsing extra paints off of a dirty paintbrush, I will rinse it over here. So that way this one gets dirty pretty quickly with all of my rinsings, but then this one stays pretty clean. And that'll just help the colors stay a little cleaner. So, or you could have 2 different things. It's just easier for me to have one, so I just have to bring one over to the sink and use that. Alright, so get some water, get some rose. And we're going to make some petals. So how are you guys doing this morning? I hope you are doing well. You guys have snow? Now on one hand, I thought it was spring, and on the other hand, here in Massachusetts, we have a tradition for having snow at all times of April. When you're doing these first petals, keep them separate from each other, because if the petals merge, then they're going to flow into each other. And our aim with these layered petals is to do a series of them and have them overlapping with each other, but to have each petal be its own shape. Right, want them to come down a little more so that they almost touch down here. There we go, like that. Let's make one more. When you're working on flowers, it's a good idea to think about some sort of a directionality with them. In general, flowers tend to seek the sun. They tend to point towards the sun. Sometimes they point towards where the wind is blowing heavily. I'm sure you've seen trees that are sort of swayed in a certain direction because the wind keeps blowing in a certain way. So I'm going to make this flower point that way, and then I'm going to make another flower point that way. Alright, so we're just going to leave those 3 petals for the first one and let that dry. And then I'm going to make another one down here that's going to be a little smaller, so maybe I'll just give it 2 petals. And I want to make it a little different color, so I think I'll mix this rose with, I'm trying to see if there's anything already on the palette that's sort of pinkish. We'll use this spot over here. So I'm just going to get out some rose. A reason to make the colors a little different is so that your painting doesn't look like it's all just one color. It makes it look a little more natural. Now let's see this. This one here is a different rose. This one's a phoenix rose versus the other one, which is a royal rose. So we'll just mix a little bit of this in here, and then we'll just make it slightly different enough that it doesn't look like this entire painting is just done with one particular color. Alright, so now we're going to make another one over here. And again, the aim is to give it 2 petals and to have them be separate from each other for now. Also comment, in general, when you're doing any sort of painting, you want to keep your main focus away from the very edge of the paper, because you're probably going to end up matting this so that your finished artwork does not touch the glass that you're framing with. And a mat needs a little bit of the edge of the paper to be able to hold it in place. So if you painted your flower right to the edge, it's going to be covered up by the mat, and that might not be what you wanted for your image. So always try to leave a little bit of empty space or generic space of just, you know, grass or trees or something like that to go with that edge area. Alright, so we got 2 flowers. Is that enough? Maybe we'll make a little bud down here. And for the bud, let's just mix in some more of this random color that's over here, just to give it a slightly different kind of color. Alright. Alright, so now we've got a first layer of petals that we are allowing to dry. Now I suppose what we can do while that is drying is we can put in some stems, because we should be able to put in the stems without touching the petals. And again, the purpose here is to get those petals completely dry before we put a second layer on that starts overlapping them. Because if we started putting on the second layer of petals right now, then that second layer would merge in with the first layers, and it would just look like a giant mush of rose colors instead of looking like individual petals all overlapping with each other. Alright, so while that is drying, I'm going to rinse that brush out. Now the stems and leaves are going to be thinner, so I'm not going to use this thicker brush. I try to use as few brushes as possible, just because it's easier that way, and because I want to encourage people just to have a few brushes. You don't need a whole bunch of brushes, but it is good to have a fluffier brush to do that kind of stuff, and then a thinner brush to do the stems and things. So this is a little number 2. And what color shall we use for the stems? Let's do a sap green. And I'm going to do this one here, which is a Marie's sap green. But you can use whatever color you want for your stems. So let's do the stems first, and then the leaves. And I can't touch the petals while I'm doing this, because otherwise the green will get drawn in with everything being wet, drawn right into that petal area, and then we'll have green petals, which, you know, is not the worst thing in the world, but that is not what I am aiming for. So we're going to make a center point. Alright, we got 1 stem. Alright, so you can make your stems however you want to. You know, you can put little petals on them if you want to. Or petals, leaves. Little leaf things if you want to. And let's put some bigger leaves on one of these. I'm going to try to put it somewhere where it's not on top of everything. I think right in here there's space for a leaf. Alright, so let's put in a leafy shape here. Alright, so we got a leaf, petal, leaf. Jeez Louise, this is early for me. Leaf. Green leaves. Right, I think we got space up here for another swoopy kind of leaf. Alright, so we got a couple of green leaves. Now those petals are still a little wet, so I am not going to risk putting new layer on there yet. So what I'm going to do is do another one while that one dries. Put that over there. Alright, so once again, what we're going to do is we're going to make a couple of petals, and we're going to make these individual petals so that we can then layer them afterwards. So we've done a rose color. Let's do a blue color. And I like this phthalo blue, which is over here, so I will do that. So let's do it the opposite way, just to have a little interest. So we're going to make some petals over here. So how are you guys doing this morning? Are you doing well? Enjoying your spring? Relaxing? Having fun? Now the trick is you sort of want to make sure that you keep track of which color you're using for the layers if you do go and do something else while they dry, so that you come back and use the same color for your subsequent layers. Alright. So part of what we are seeing while we are doing this is you want your eye to flow through the composition of your painting. So you wouldn't necessarily want all of your flowers to be at the exact same level, because that creates sort of a static feeling. It's nice to have sort of like a left, right, left kind of feel. And over here we have the top on the left, the next one on the right, and then the lower one on the left. So we're going to do the opposite here. We're going to do the top right, we're going to go the middle left, and then we're going to put a little bud over here. Right. Rinse that off. Alright, let's see if we can find an even thinner brush for making these. For this one, this is a 1. Alright, we'll try a 1 for the stems, because I think I want it even a little thinner than that. Alright. Last time we used the Marie's sap green, and I will in fact grab a little notepad for myself. I can make a note that 1 was a royal rose with a Marie's sap green. 2 was the phthalo. I'm going to try the royal sap green. Hey Anne, good to see you. Alright, so trying an even smaller brush to get even thinner stems, and my hands tend to be a little shaky, as you've undoubtedly seen, so that's, you know, just part of life. Guess gives my watercolors a more naturalistic kind of soft feel to it. Alright, so let's get into the sap green here. starting point. Alright, that's a little more than what I was thinking. Alright, so we got some stems for the blue flowers. I think we'll give this one a set of leaves since it ended up being the thicker one out of the grouping. Or maybe this one can have a leaf too. Alright, so now I got some green in there. So let's see how dry this is. The petals actually look fairly dry. There's a little tiny glimmer over there, but that seems dry up there. Alright, so let us try making a different layer over there. Alright, so this one was the royal rose. And we have to try to be careful when we put the second layer on that it does not smear the first layer. So, get the royal rose. Let's see if I got a clear spot over here somewhere. Oh, this area down here. Let's try clearing that out first and rinsing that. What I'm doing is trying to dilute this down a little bit so that it goes on a little lighter for this next layer of petals. I want it to be seen that it overlaps the other petals without it smearing away that lower level and scrubbing it off. So it's sort of a delicate balance. So I wanted to fill in this space, show that it's overlapping, but if you press too hard with your brush, you can actually scrub away that bottom layer, and I don't want that to happen. Alright, so see how you can see the new petal. It's a little lighter than the previous petal because I added some water to it. And you can see where it overlaps the other petal. It did alter the color of the overlapping spaces. Alright, so let's put a little one over here. It's also important to remember that watercolors dry lighter than they go on. So when you're looking at this while you're putting the different things on, remember that it's going to lighten up as it goes. Alright, now those two are starting to merge together, so I'm going to stop with that one. I was going to put another bottom petal in, but I don't like the way that they merge together down there, so I should have just put those two in there and then stopped and let those dry. So this is part of the process. You see what you like, and then maybe you do another one that you do a little bit differently to get more in the style that you wanted. So we're just going to put the two bottom petals on in this one and not have them touch each other at all. let that dry. And I'm just going to put very thin little edge petals on this. Alright, see, I have to resist. Not keep poking away at it and let the pieces dry. So this is part of the challenge here. So I just did that, which is a fairly little amount of work on the painting, but now I can't touch it again until those layers dry. So that's part of why it's good to work on a couple of these at a time. So while that is drying, I can come over to this one. This one looks like it is pretty dry. It's still a little cool to the touch, which means it's not perfectly dry, but for our purposes it should be dry enough. Rinse all of the rose off of the brush. Come back and get a little of this phthalo blue. I'll put over here and dilute it down a bit so that it is lighter. Right, so now we're going to put on the second petal. Another petal over here. Right, so normally I'd be tempted to put a petal in there, but as soon as I touch those, we're going to have this kind of merging problem that we ended up with over there because I was impatient. So we are going to stop. We're going to put something over here instead. It's good to be patient with watercolors. Patient and relaxed. Like a little side petal here. Alright, so we are building up our layer effect. And now I've got two of them that are both wet. So what I'm going to do is take another piece of paper. Put those over there. Alright, so what color combination should we do for our third one? What have we got as options? Purple. I like purple. Alright, so which purple? I think the Phoenix Violet, that's sort of dark, maybe the Maurice Violet. It's funny, and I'll pull my sheet out over again. I have three different violets because I really like the color violet. So the Royal Violet, the Phoenix Violet, and the Maurice Violet, and you can see that they are each different from each other. So even if you get something with the exact same name, it can have different sort of shades to it. And as I'm looking at this, I really like the mauve too, but we already have a rose in the mix, so I'll do it the Maurice Violet, I think. A nice soft violet. Let's give that a shot. Alright, so rinse off the brush. Oh, hey April. That is great. Thank you so much for joining us. Alright, so again, when we do the first layer, we're just going to do a couple of petals, and we're not going to let them touch each other so that the petals each end up being its own shape. If things touch each other when they are wet, then they tend to merge into each other, and that's how we end up with this sort of a combination shape over here in the pink flowers. So we want to, in general, keep each petal wholly separate and then let it dry, and that'll create this layer effect that we're after. So I am trying to get my way in to the Maurice Violet, which is that one right there. So I'll rinse off my brush again. Get some nice clean water. Get some of the Marie's violet. Yeah, just made a little violet drop on my pink flower. Alright, move it this way. Again, when you make your initial petals, the main thing is to keep each one separate from its neighbors so that they don't merge together. And have them come down to some sort of a centralish point, which will be the center of this flower. And it doesn't matter exactly what shape it is, because as we know from the real world, flowers are all fairly different. And flowers come in all shapes, sizings, and colors. So whatever way you decide to paint yours, there is undoubtedly a flower out there somewhere that has that shape. So we'll put one over here. I was getting shadowed somehow. Let me see if I can. That seems to be better. It's a delicate balance with this setup between having things get too bright for you so that they get blown out and you can't see them. Let's try turning that down a little. Having it too dark so you can't see what's happening. In our modern world with these lights that have all these different settings, sometimes that can make it better, and sometimes that can seem to make it worse. Alright, this time I made all of the purples the exact same color. I tend to like to have each one be a little different, so I'm going to mix a little blue in to this bud, so it has a little bit of a different color to it. Because in nature, flowers all tend to have a bit of different coloring to them. And what could I do to that one? Well, I have some of this darker blue down here left over from a previous project. So we'll just pick up some of this darker blue. The idea is just to have them be a little bit different from each other, so it adds a little bit of visual interest to the flowers. Alright, I mean, clearly they're not gigantically different. They're all still pretty much the same color, just a little bit of individuality. Well, thank you, Becky. Rebecca. So much. I can type. Alright, so I think the red ones should be dry by now. This is always the trick. Is it dry? Alright, it's still cool, but it is pretty much dry. So we'll put this over here. Let those ones dry. Take a look at this one. Then there's also the question of how many layers are enough layers. You want to go too crazy with having way too many layers and then have it just get lost. You know, there's a balance in there somewhere. I think I do want to have at least one more layer in here. And I've lost my pencil. There's a pencil. Alright, so I was just making notes for myself that that one was a Marie Violet. So that when I come back around, I remember what I am doing. Alright, so we are trying to get to the rose. She's under there. Alright, so now we want to go really, really light with the rose. I'm just making a space over here so I can do a little bit of mixing. Some people like to completely clear off all of their painting areas before they start fresh, but I am frugal, so I tend to use these colors because often I mix up a color that I find interesting and then I can use it for another painting. So I'd rather not lose all of that paint, because that paint is still completely useful and worth working with. But on the other hand, I need a little spot over here to mix some of my rose. I want to make this really light now, so I'm going to take a bunch of water. Alright, so now I've got a fairly diluted rose, but also remember that it's going to dry lighter, so don't put it on too light because then it will just become invisible. Alright, so now we're going to put on some littler petals. For accents. And we're still going to try to not let these new smaller petals touch each other. We're going to try to have them end up poking out a little in these spare spaces, so it helps them be visible. We're going to try to do this gently without rubbing too hard on the under petals, because that could scrub the under petals away, and our aim here is not to scrub those under petals away, but to layer on top of them. So again, it's sort of tricky with watercolors, because many times the technique is to scrub away at the under layers and to mix the layers together and so on, but what we're trying to do here is gently lay a new layer on top of those previous layers. So we'll just put it on nice and soft so it sits on top of the previous layer without scrubbing it off. All right. Put in a little under petal there. Put in an under petal layer there. If we put in, if we put in a petal and we didn't have the end of it poking out somewhere, it could just get lost. Like if I put in a petal in here, it would just maybe look like a little mishmash down in this area and wouldn't even necessarily look like a petal. So it's good to have your new petal, each new petal, poke out a little somewhere, because it's that poking out that helps the eye see it and then see that the rest of the shape that goes with it all belongs together. We may be at the point with the bud that we have added enough layers that that is what it can hold, because otherwise that'll get really messy looking. But we will just maybe add a little bit of an under petal there. Just like that. Alright, so let's let that dry. Rinse off the brush. Put that over there. Have that dry. I have cats, so I end up with cat hairs everywhere. They do not get completely stuck into the paint like they would with acrylics or oil paints, so it's fine just to leave them if you see something, and then you can brush it out at the very end. They'll come right out of the watercolors in general without causing any problem. Alright, so this is a little cool. Still a little cool, but I think that will be alright. Alright, so this was the phthalo blue. What I'm going to do is clear out a spot down here for us to work with. Maybe this spot over here, although I did like that little bit of green. Now, there's only so many colors you can save for yourself. Alright, I'm going to get an actual piece of paper. Clear out my spot. Alright. So we'll get some phthalo blue. here. Add some water so we get it nice and dilute. Alright, so again we're going to try to do this in a way that each petal stays separate from the others and that a bit of the petal pokes up into an empty space so that the eye can see this as a petal. Alright, so that was an empty space we could work into. A little bit of overlap. There's a spot over here. I have to be careful not to touch that other petal I just made. As tempting as it might be, then it ends up being a mush if you let the petals touch. Make a little bit of a under petal there. I think that's all that I can do on that one without causing something to touch. Over here we've got a spot here that can have a petal poking out. We've got a spot over here. And remember that even though these look like they're going on light, they're going to get even lighter. So try to be aware of doing it a little darker than you would want, because with these petals it's a little harder to go back and add additional layers to a petal because we're layering as it is with what we are doing. Alright, make a little under petal here. A little under petal over here. Alright, I think that's all that we can do on that one. To be able to get that to stay. So I'm going to rinse the blue out from my brush. And I think that the purple may be ready for us. Or the violet. This is violet. Alright, it's a little cool, but it is pretty dry. Alright, so put that over there. Alright, I think I'm going to give in and make a violet spot down here too, so that we have everything down in a workable area. Alright, another little piece of paper to clean up my spot. Alright, so I'm going to take a little bit of the, I think we're on Marie's violet, right? Yep, Marie's violet. She's right there. Alright, a little bit of water. Alright, so again, when we do our next petals, we want them to be poking out into an area so that they can be seen, slightly overlapping with the existing petals, and don't touch each other while they're wet. I really want to put one there, but it's going to end up touching those guys, and we have to avoid doing that. I think I could put one more over here without the bottoms touching. We want a little bit of overlap with the existing ones. Alright, and a little bit of outer petal for this. Alright, and while that is drying, I can put in some stems over here. So let's see. Now here I said that I don't advocate having 80,000 brushes, but now here I am trying to find the thinnest brush that I've got. So sometimes it is useful to have, this is a 00, to have really thin brushes if you're trying to do something in particular like this. And you should be able to get a set of brushes for, you know, $8 to $10, which on one hand isn't zero amount of money, but on the other hand you can use these brushes for years and years and years and years. So it's a investment that will then help you enjoy yourself for quite a long time. So I think it's worth it spending the $8 or $10 to be able to get a batch of brushes that you really enjoy and that can let you do all sorts of things. Because, you know, I use one brush for the larger shapes, but then it's really nice to have a smaller brush to be able to do those thinner shapes. Alright, so what color do we want to use for the stems here? We've used sap greens for the other ones. This is a darker purple. Let's use the green deep. What do you think? Yeah, let's do right down Marie Green Deep. Alright, which is under the blue. See Marie's? Yeah, Marie's Green Deep. Alright. Again, a challenge for me is that my hands are shaking, so trying to get a stem to go exactly where I want it to go is sometimes challenging, but you do the best you can. Alright. There you go. So you can see how that's even thinner than those. And you can make it thicker by dragging it out so that shows that it gets thicker as it goes down to the base. Or if you want to keep it thinner for some reason, you can just keep it thin for the whole way. It is completely up to you. So, like this little one might stay thin because it's just a little small flower. Even so though, you know, people paint that sometimes, but is there really a chance that a stem that is that thin is going to be able to hold up a flower head that is that big? Probably not. So I tend to err on the thicker side for the stems, which feels more realistic to me, but I also understand that that looks pretty to have a thin stem. So it is up to you what you want to do. Give them some leaves. Are we just going to have little leaves on this one instead of big swoopy leaves? I don't know. Apparently I'm adding big swoopy leaves, but not as big as the other ones. Littler swoopy leaves. I think I want this to be darker. Alright. Not this style of flowers is supposed to be light and brisk, so I will not poke away at it. I will just let it be. Alright, what is dry? Alright, these are pretty dry. So the question is, do I really want more layers on it? And I think the answer is no. It is tempting, but I think I'm going to go with no. That one has enough layers, and if I add more then it will just start to get cluttered. Because with each petal that you put in, you want to be able to see the edge of the petal, and I was thinking, well, I could put one in there and there, but this is supposed to be the simpler flower. This is supposed to be the busier flower, and then the simpler one, and then the simplest. So if I start making that too busy, then it takes away from that. And I don't think I want to put any more layers in here because it's already got plenty of layers. Alright, so we will call this one done. We'll put in the name. Alright, which then brings us to the blue one. Alright, so looking at this one, do we want more layers? Again, there's spaces that we could tuck in more layers, but I think that that would end up having just too many different pieces to the flowers. This one again is supposed to be the simpler one, and that's already got a whole bunch of layers for being just a simple little bud. So I think I will also call this one done. Now brings us to the purple one, which I don't think is dry yet. Oh wait, it could actually be dry. It is still cool, which means it is still damp, but it may be dry enough that I can get that last petal in, which is the one that I really care about. Alright, so rinse off my brush. Get some nice clean water. Put a little bit of the very light of the violet. So just only a little bit of paint on there. So what we really need is this one in here, because it was a gap. And one in here, which is another gap. I'm tempted to put another thing in there, maybe just a little under petal. And the same thing here, maybe just a little tiny under petal. It can be tempting to keep adding and adding to these things, but part of what you want to find is that balance for yourself about where the line is between having enough things to make it interesting and then making it too busy so that you've lost the simple layered nature of this kind of a painting. Alright, and I think I will call that one done too. So on that. Alright, so it's the same technique, just used with different colors and a little bit of different arrangements on them. So this one was used with a Royal Langle Rose with a Marie's sap green for the leaves. This one was with a Reeves Phthalo blue, and that had the Reeves sap green. And then this one over here was a Marie's violet, and that was done with a Marie's green deep as the green. So different shades of color create different effects. And also what I did was I did the main flower with a straight version of each color, and then for the other flowers I added just in a little tiny bit of some random other color, just so they didn't look exactly the same. So they looked a little more purple or a little more red or a little more something to give a bit of visual interest to the layout. So let me know if you have any questions about how layered flower petals work. A key of it is to do each petal separately and let it dry before you do any other petal that touches it. And that way each petal retains its petal shape and doesn't blend or blur into its neighbor petals. So I did have that happen once over here, and actually you can't really see it now anymore. But if you have two petals that are wet that are touched, they will merge together into one massive shape, and that isn't quite what we're after for this. When we're doing this kind of painting, we're trying to show that each petal is its own separate little entity and that they have overlapping sections. So soft brush strokes so you don't brush away the underlayers. Do lighter and darker versions with the same color so that you get these kinds of layered petal effects. And let me know if you have any questions about how this is done, and I'm happy to answer them.